The cop sneered and shouted, "People with your skin color should know to bow their heads and follow orders." Rick Dalton was the one who pointed a gun at a man's head simply because he was black. He screamed, finger tightening on the trigger, eyes full of hatred. He forced the man down against the car window, just because of a strange license plate and a silent demeanor. But the man calmly unlocked his phone, entered a code, and connected directly to the Pentagon. What no one expected was that the victim held security clearance higher than any local commanding officer. When ignorance crashes into real power, the law's mask slips instantly. Are the police any better where you live? The sun pressed down like a judgment, harsh and inescapable, casting long, hot shadows across the cracked pavement of County Route 17, dust shimmering in the heat, warping the outlines of the road, the signs. Rick Dalton sat in his cruiser, fingers drumming the edge of the steering wheel, his eyes narrowing behind standard-issue sunglasses, the cruiser's AC hissing, weak and unconvincing against the midsummer glare, as his gaze locked on the vehicle in front of him. A dusty, older model Ford Crown Victoria with out-of-state plates, slightly veering left of center, but not enough to sight, not enough to pull over, not really. Still, Rick's hand crept toward the radio. "County 7 to dispatch," he said, voice flat. "I'm making a 1038, southbound on 17, single occupant, black male driver. The plate reads Ohio Delta Tango 679. He clicked off the mic, already exiting the car. He didn't flip on his lights. He didn't need to. The Crown Victoria had already slowed, obedient, pulling off the road's shoulder and crunching over gravel. As Rick approached the driver's side window, his boot falls steady, sun on his back, he noted everything with the precise instinct of a man who'd built his career on instincts. The dull orange of the man's t-shirt, the fact that the window only rolled down halfway, the driver's hands at 10 and 2, no sudden movements, no fumbling for documents, and no words. Rick stopped beside the window, one hand hovering near his service weapon. It wasn't a conscious choice, it never was. Habit, maybe, or something deeper, something trained, ingrained, rewarded. He leaned slightly, enough to peer inside. The man didn't turn to look at him, just kept his eyes straight ahead, face unreadable, the car's interior immaculate, military clean, no air fresheners, no clutter, no noise, stereo off. Rick cleared his throat. "License and registration, please." Silence. Then a breath, barely audible, like the man had inhaled, considered speaking, and then decided not to. Rick's hand edged closer to the grip of his pistol. The man moved, not much, just a slight tilt of his head toward the side mirror, as if watching the cop, assessing. One brow arched, not in challenge, but in recognition of something, of someone. Rick bristled. "Sir," he said, this time louder, "I need your license and registration." The man didn't reach, didn't even flinch, didn't do anything that could be labeled non-compliant, but didn't comply either, and it was worse than that. It was intentional calm. That kind of stillness that made Rick feel like the only one nervous. Then the sound of tires skidding on loose gravel cut through the tension, a child's voice ringing out, high and careless, from the sidewalk nearby. "Mom says not to talk to people like that," a little white boy declared, riding his bike in lazy loops around a mailbox. "People in junk cars like that don't belong here." The words hung in the air like smoke. Rick didn't correct him, didn't blink. He watched the boy pedal away, then glanced back at the driver. The man's face hadn't changed, still calm, still silent. Rick's hand stayed near his weapon. He leaned in a little more. "You got a reason not to talk to me, sir? Something you're hiding?" "Nothing." The heat pressed in. A bead of sweat trickled down Rick's temple, disappeared into the collar of his uniform, and the silence grew oppressive, like the air between them had thickened. Still, the man said nothing. Rick stepped back half a pace, narrowing his eyes. "All right, if you want to play that game, we'll do this the hard way." He reached for the radio, the threat already forming on his lips. He hadn't seen a weapon, hadn't seen a reason. But something about the man's silence, it cut deeper than any resistance Rick had faced in years. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't fear, it was the absence of both. It was unbothered, it was dangerous. Because Rick couldn't read it, box it in. or shake the sense that the man knew something he didn't. As he called in backup, a part of Rick Dalton, buried beneath years of training, pride, and power, wondered why he was suddenly sweating in his boots and why the man in the orange shirt hadn't blinked once. The moment Rick Dalton's fingers brushed the radio, that quiet, dangerous calm inside the car twisted something deeper inside him, a need to assert, to dominate, to make the man in the orange shirt flinch, react, acknowledge his authority, but the man didn't. He just sat there, hands on the wheel, gaze steady, posture unshaken, the embodiment of control in the face of a man who had never been told no. Rick's pulse quickened, his jaw locked. He stepped back into position, drew in a sharp breath, and shouted, "Step out of the vehicle, now!" No response. Not a twitch, not a glance, not a damn blink. Just the wind, hot and sharp, pulling at the corners of Rick's uniform, fluttering the short-sleeved hem like the opening note of something unraveling. His right hand lowered, slow, deliberate, and unhooked the strap over his holster. The click it made was intentional, measured, a threat forged not in words, but in sound. Rick gritted his teeth. Last warning, out of the vehicle. He didn't wait. He drew. The pistol came up in one motion, practiced, arrogant, the muzzle landing just inches from the half-open window. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look at the weapon. He looked past it, past Rick, past the entire charade of small-town dominance, with eyes that didn't see Rick as a threat, but as a child playing dress-up with a loaded toy. Rick snarled. He hated the way that look made him feel, insignificant, unread, vulnerable. You think you're smarter than me? You think silence makes you tough, that it buy you something here? Still nothing. That same goddamn silence. Rick's knuckles whitened around the grip, and the trigger begged for weight. From the corner of his vision, he noticed movement. The woman from the house across the street had stepped onto her porch. She wasn't filming, but her face, the pinched disgust in her eyes, registered something Rick hadn't seen in years. Doubt, not in the suspect, in him. Rick shouted again, "Get out! Don't make me open this door myself." The man inside the Crown Victoria finally moved, but not how Rick expected. One hand left the wheel, slow and precise, and rested on the windowsill, palm open, fingers relaxed. The message was clear. I'm not resisting. I'm not complying either. I don't need to. You're the one unraveling. Rick banged the butt of his hand against the roof. You're playing with fire. You want to charge? Obstruction? Failure to comply? I'll write you up for everything I can and then some. His voice cracked. Not loud, but sharp. A break Rick felt in his bones. The man remained stone, not cold, not warm, just certain, like he had read the script and knew Rick wasn't the final act. Then came the sound that truly set Rick's nerves on edge. Footsteps, boots. From behind, the female deputy, younger, eyes wide. She said nothing at first, only stood there, processing what she was seeing. When she spoke, her voice was thin. "Sarge, you sure about this?" Rick didn't look at her. Couldn't. She paused, then, "Or maybe just not stupid." Rick's heart thudded. The pistol lowered an inch. Sweat slid behind his ear. Every part of his body screamed at him to regain control. But the air was no longer his. The moment had shifted, and, for the first time in years, Rick Dalton was no longer the center of it. He stepped back. Only a half foot, but it felt like a retreat. The man still hadn't blinked, still hadn't spoken, but he'd dismantled Rick's command without lifting a finger. The silence was no longer empty, it was damning. It said everything Rick feared it might. It said, "You lost this. You, not me." Rick wanted to reassert, to shout, to escalate, but there was nothing left that wouldn't look like panic, and Rick Dalton did not panic. Not publicly, not until now. He turned away slightly, enough to wipe his brow, enough to give himself the illusion of regrouping, but he knew the moment had etched itself into the air, into the sidewalk, into the woman's glare across the street, into the deputy's widened eyes. Worst of all, into that damn window where a man in an orange shirt never once had to raise his voice, or his hand, to win. Rick holstered his weapon slowly, trying to reclaim dignity in the act, but it felt hollow. He clicked the radio. "Dispatch, this is County 7. Situation under review. Stand by." No response, just static, just heat, just the echo of his voice disappearing into a summer that now belonged to someone else. He glanced back once more. The man hadn't moved, hadn't smiled, hadn't even changed expression, but Rick saw it. Saw what the man never had to say. That he knew, that he understood. That silence, well aimed, was sometimes the loudest threat of all. The moment clung to Rick Dalton like humidity to skin, thick, unsheddable, every breath sticking in his chest as he tried to reclaim authority that was no longer his. But just as he shifted his stance and opened his mouth to speak again, the man inside the car moved. Not his body, not his voice, but his hand, rising from the steering wheel with slow, deliberate control, retrieving a black device from the console beside him, thin, unmarked, clean, the kind of phone Rick had seen once before. Military issue, unmistakable to those who knew. Rick's lips parted, not in command but in disbelief, as the man tapped the screen, his thumb gliding across the surface with calm precision, entering a code, too fast for Rick to read, but not fast enough to ignore. There was a beep, then a flash, and then the screen changed. Rick saw it, bright, clear, centered. DoD Alpha, level clearance. No logos, no seal, just 5 words and a black background. Stark as a threat whispered in the dark. The kind of screen that didn't come from apps or downloads or consumer networks. Rick took a half step back, not retreating, he told himself, just adjusting. Reassessing, realigning the pieces of a picture that no longer fit in his frame of power. But his gun was still out, and he kept it steady, barely. The man's face did not shift, no smirk, no warning, just focus. He pressed a second code. Another tone sounded. Then a voice, synthetic, female, sharp, and unwavering, emerged from the phone's speaker. Priority link established. Secure connection active. Awaiting command clearance. Rick blinked. The deputy behind him whispered, "What the hell is that?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. His grip on the pistol wavered imperceptibly. This wasn't a man calling a lawyer. This wasn't a bluff. This was an access point to something Rick wasn't supposed to see. Something above his badge. Above his jurisdiction. Above everything. The man lifted the phone, letting the screen catch the sunlight, reflecting its contents directly into Rick's eyes. It wasn't a threat. It was an introduction. "Back away from the vehicle," the voice from the device said again, and it wasn't just sound. It was a command. Not loud, not forceful. But finally, Rick clenched his jaw. "This isn't protocol," he muttered, mostly to himself. "This isn't how this works." But he didn't move forward either. The man placed the phone back on the dashboard, perfectly aligned. Screen still active, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. He returned his hands to the wheel exactly where they had been before, except now Rick saw them differently. Not as compliance, as control. Total, deliberate, untouchable control. For a moment, Rick forgot he had a gun in his hand. The weight of it felt wrong, like he was holding something cheap in the face of something vast, like shouting into a canyon and hearing only his fear echo back. Another beep, another voice, this time lower, male, rough-edged. "Authorization confirmed. The command line is open. Please state the direct." The man in the car didn't speak. He didn't need to. The presence of that line alone said everything. Rick glanced at the deputy again. She was staring, mouth slightly open, hands resting at her sides. "Is that real?" she asked. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from recognition of power, of proximity to something she had only read about in briefings she thought were exaggerations. Rick's hand lowered an inch, just one. But in that inch, the entire shape of the moment shifted again. The man hadn't raised his voice, hadn't raised his hand, but Rick could feel it. Authority had left him, drained like sweat from a scalp beneath the summer sun. The device crackled once more. "Colonel, authorization valid. DoD. Override in effect. Local enforcement status suspended." Rick stepped back. Further this time, 2 full paces. The pistol dipped, but didn't holster. His mouth opened. No words came. Inside the Crown Victoria, the man's eyes finally met Rick's. There was no smugness, no mockery. Just the cold precision of a man who didn't need to win an argument, because the war had been over long before the first word was ever spoken. Rick turned off the safety without thinking, then thought better of it and re-engaged. His mouth was dry, his stance broken, a man holding a weapon he no longer believed in. The deputy stepped forward. "Sarge," she whispered, more plea than statement. Rick nodded once, slowly, robotic. "Stand down." The man looked away first, not as a concession, but as a declaration, "This is finished." And it was. Rick felt it, deep, crushing, irrefutable. In the stillness that followed, only one thing moved, the pulsing light of the phone screen. Still connected, still waiting, like a line that did not need to be answered, because it already had been. The heat clung to Rick's back like wet fabric, sweat pooling beneath his vest as he kept the muzzle fixed on the man with the burnt orange shirt and motionless eyes. Behind the reflective sheen of the windshield, that same impenetrable stare met his, silent, unreadable, as if judging a creature beneath notice. The voice in Rick's head screamed warnings louder than the radio chatter in his ear. His trigger finger twitched near the metal curve, barely held back by duty or doubt. He wasn't sure which. "Turn it off," Rick roared, his voice cutting through the boiling afternoon air like cracked glass, the barrel of his service pistol trembling with impatience, with fear disguised as command. The man moved then, not to cower, not to comply, but to lift the phone already in his hand, deliberately, slowly, as though Rick's rage were nothing more than background noise. With one tap, the screen lit up. A few keystrokes followed, methodical, unhurried. Then his voice came, his first. It was not raised, not sharp, not burdened with panic or pride, just calm, cold, unmoving. "I'm calling your superior's superior." The words didn't echo, they detonated. Rick's pulse kicked hard against his throat. The phone's glow seemed brighter, and for the first time Rick noticed what pulsed at the center of the screen, a black phoenix. Its wings wide, its body haloed by lines of encrypted characters, shifting, vanishing, reappearing like coded ghosts. No badge, no name, no rank, just that symbol, and the overwhelming pressure of something far above his clearance breathing down through that small, rectangular screen. His vision tunneled. The sun flickered at the edges. Rick blinked, but the phoenix stayed. A silent brand pressed onto his retina. The hand that gripped the gun began to slick with sweat. His knuckles had gone pale, too pale, and his joints ached from the tension locked in his forearm. It wasn't the heat anymore. It was something else, something behind those still, watchful eyes. He didn't lower the gun, but he stepped back, half a foot, almost imperceptible, except to the man watching him through the glass. That half step betrayed everything. His resolve, his authority, his belief that he was still in control. "You're bluffing," Rick said, but the words lacked the fire he needed. They dropped like stones. The man didn't smile, he didn't blink. He simply held Rick's gaze like a vice. The silence between them thickened. Even the cicadas seemed to go quiet. Behind Rick, the young female officer stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. She hadn't drawn her weapon. She hadn't spoken, but the look in her eyes screamed uncertainty, a woman watching something unravel that she couldn't stop. Rick gritted his teeth. He could feel the scene slipping, the narrative escaping his grip like water through a clenched fist. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Compliance, escalation, arrest. That was the script. But now the man in the orange shirt was writing the lines. One glance, one sentence at a time. "Get out of the car! Hands where I can see them!" Rick barked again, this time louder, but the desperation bled through. And then, slowly, as if dismissing a question rather than defying an order, the man moved his eyes from Rick to the phone and tapped once more. The screen shimmered, and the black phoenix glowed red at its edges, its wings folding in a slow, ominous animation. From within the car, a single soft tone rang out. Confirmation or command, Rick couldn't tell. All he knew was that something had just been sent somewhere to someone. Rick's body tensed, but his spirit staggered. A pulse of static hit his radio. No voice, just interference, brief but intentional. A trickle of sweat ran down his temple, stinging his eye. He blinked it away, but not the image. He couldn't unsee that symbol. Not just a logo, not just tech. It meant something. It meant access, authority, untouchability. And now it was staring back at him from a stranger's screen, midday, in the middle of a routine stop. As no one moved, no one spoke. Only the man's voice returned, one last time, quieter, final. "You made this choice, now watch." The sentence wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. Rick swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat remained. The weapon in his hand, once an extension of his will, now felt heavier than his guilt. His breath hitched. He shifted his stance, unsure if it was for balance or retreat. Either way, it didn't matter. The power had already changed hands, and it hadn't even needed to be taken, just revealed. And still, Rick kept the barrel raised, though he could no longer claim why. Pride, habit, or because lowering it now would mean admitting what his body already knew, that the balance had broken and he was no longer the force in the room. Behind his eyes, something cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough for the truth to whisper through. The man in the car hadn't fought, hadn't shouted, hadn't flinched. He had simply answered, and that answer was enough to make the gun tremble in Rick Dalton's hand. He hadn't lowered the gun, but it no longer belonged to him. It hung there, weighty and pointless, a symbol stripped of meaning in the silence left by that final sentence. Rick stood in that silence, seared by it, until another sound split the air. Not the shuffle of feet, not the rustle of leaves, but a voice, female, clipped, undeniable. "Lower your weapon. Now." The tone wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, and the calibrated, sharper than a siren, colder than steel, designed to slice clean through doubt. Rick didn't ask where it came from. He didn't need to. The phone in the driver's hand glowed once more. No image on the screen now, just a pulsing white light and the echo of that order hanging in the heat like smoke. His ears rang, not from volume, but from pressure. Command delivered not as suggestion, but his pulse doubled. Behind him, she moved. The young officer, she hadn't spoken since this began, took one hesitant step back, her foot crunching against gravel, as if afraid to be caught in the act of uncertainty. She didn't look at Rick. She didn't whisper or call his name. Her retreat was silent, instinctive, born from something older than protocol. She didn't know what she had heard, not entirely, but she knew enough. That voice did not belong to a negotiator. It belonged to someone who issued instructions that rewrote the chain of command, who made rank irrelevant. Rick's mouth opened, but produced nothing. His tongue, dry and sluggish, couldn't shape denial. Somewhere in the static behind his eyes, he remembered training, remembered a diagram in a worn-out manual. Escalation of force. What they never printed in the margins was the moment when force stopped being yours to escalate. That moment had come, and it had arrived through a speaker smaller than a coin. Then came the second blow. His radio, quiet until now, exploded to life. Not in chatter, not in the usual broken dispatch code, but a tone. One high, one low, then a silence so deliberate it screamed. After it, a single phrase, "Stand down." Repeat. Immediate stand down. All units cease engagement. No call sign, no station ID. The signal was clean, surgical. And that was the tell. It hadn't come from headquarters. It had come from above them all. Somewhere air-conditioned and sealed. Somewhere where the walls didn't echo unless someone important wanted them to. Rick's spine prickled. He didn't turn to look at his partner. He didn't glance at the man in the car. He stared ahead, as if somehow refusing to blink would rewind what had just happened. The gun was still in his hand, and it had never felt more ridiculous. Then, without fanfare, from the corner of his vision, motion. A dark blur cut across the sun-bleached street. No sirens, no lights, just rubber on hot pavement and mat-thick armor sliding into view. An SUV, unmarked, silent, absorbing heat instead of reflecting it. It rolled to a stop a dozen yards down, aligned perfectly, not rushed, not threatening, just present. And somehow, that was worse. The hum of its engine was low and steady, nearly indistinguishable from the ambient noise of the day, but Rick felt it in his ribs, a vibration that reached through muscle and bone like a second heartbeat. No logos, no tags, just black glass and sealed doors, as if the vehicle itself had secrets. His fingers flexed once on the grip. No one had told him to drop it. Not again. But the message had already been delivered. Not with volume, but with structure, with the chain that had just been cut from the top down. The driver, Ezra Maddox, though Rick still hadn't dared say the name, hadn't moved. His phone remained steady, hand relaxed, screen still casting that faint internal glow. The voice hadn't returned, but it didn't need to. The silence now obeyed her. Rick exhaled, not in relief, but defeat. A silent, involuntary surrender that didn't bend the knees, but twisted the stomach. His authority hadn't been taken. It had been dismissed, not by force, by presence. That voice, that signal, that SUV, all coordinated, all quiet, all final. And in that dense, invisible fog of power, Rick realized something deeper than humiliation. He wasn't outgunned. He was irrelevant. The badge on his chest, the training he'd once clung to, the weight of the gun in his hand, they belonged to a world that no longer ruled this street, and for the first time, he wasn't sure who did. Rick hadn't put the gun down, but the weight of it no longer mattered. It hung in his grip like a rusted relic from a past that didn't belong to this moment, like a weapon forged for lesser wars. Rick stared at the man in the driver's seat and saw not defiance, not arrogance, but an indifference so profound it cut deeper than any open threat. His breath came shallow, one beat removed from panic, not because of what had been said, not even because of the SUV parked in silence at the edge of the block, but because of what was being withheld, the unspoken, the unsaid, the unfathomable weight of a presence so composed it destabilized everything around it. And in that dizzying quiet, something rose. Not fear, memory, sharp, unforgiving, Ghost Commander. The name floated up unbidden, like a curse long buried under paper trails and sealed tongues. He hadn't thought of it in years. Not seriously. No one did. You didn't name him, you avoided it. It wasn't protocol. It was survival. Ghost Commander wasn't a title you saluted. It was a cautionary tale, murmured in corridors when real monsters were being measured. The kind of name that made even seasoned operatives flinch, that turned field reports into whispers, and created gaps in black-budget documents no one dared question. Rick had first heard it during a night op debrief that went sideways. A lieutenant scarred, no nonsense, the kind of man who called things what they were, had leaned in after a failed interception and said 5 words Rick never forgot. If you see him, leave. Then it shifted, subtle, precise. The man adjusted his wrist, and the cuff of his sleeve lifted just slightly. It was enough to reveal the mark Rick hadn't wanted to see, but now couldn't ignore. A phoenix, black as midnight and etched like ritual across the skin. Not just ink, not stylized. This wasn't a tattoo for the sake of memory or vanity. This was something older, coded, ceremonial. The wings curved upward, arching like a blade. The eyes of the phoenix, narrowed, downcast, seemed to judge not in anger, but in perfect calm. Rick blinked, but it didn't go away. It never went away. Not the image and not the memory it dragged to the surface. Ghost Commander. 2 words never spoken in daylight. 2 syllables that turned conversations cold in shadowed halls. Rick had heard them years ago, muttered by a man who'd seen too much to keep steady. Not during training. Never official. It came after a botched extraction in Cairo in a tent soaked in adrenaline and blood. A sergeant, burned, trembling, had pulled Rick aside and said, "You'll know him if you don't know him. He doesn't announce, doesn't confirm, doesn't need to." Then he'd fallen silent and no one ever brought it up again. But Rick had remembered, and now he stood in a nameless intersection, in a town too ordinary for this level of reckoning, staring through glass at the embodiment of that whisper, Ezra Maddox. It wasn't confirmed. There had been no identification, but Rick didn't need one. The way silence had replaced command, the way the woman's voice had dropped from the phone like a hammer. The SUV was idling without decals. The Phoenix, that stare, and worse, his fear of the answer. He tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a copycat. Maybe someone with access to inside knowledge. Maybe this wasn't what it seemed, but the thoughts barely formed before his instincts crushed them. There was no copycat presence like this. No fake authority could freeze a precinct by speaking once. No amateur could carry that much absence. His partner, the rookie, hadn't said a word, but he heard her breathing. Slow, steady, then one step back. A shift in gravel. She didn't say it, but her body already had. She knew, not who he was, but what he was. And that was enough. Rick's fingers curled tighter around the grip, not out of readiness, but as if afraid that releasing it would mean releasing the illusion that he still had a role here. The weapon was no longer a threat. It was a lifeline, the last piece of uniform weight he could still claim. But it didn't matter. The lines had been redrawn without his consent, and he was standing outside them, badge or not. The man said nothing. The ink on his wrist was still visible. A quiet declaration that made every breath Rick took feel like a mistake. He thought about lowering the weapon. Then he thought about what it would mean to lower it, not because it was safe, but because he was outmatched. And then he realized that the choice had already been made for him. Ghost's commander. The name still throbbed like a pulse between his ears. He wanted to scream at himself, at the system, at the silence, but mostly at the fact that no one had warned him what it would feel like to face a myth, not to fight, not to question, just to face and lose. The man never moved. The Phoenix never blinked, and Rick, somewhere between disbelief and dread, realized what he'd done. He hadn't just pointed a weapon at someone important. He had declared war on a man whose existence was designed to prevent wars and finish them when necessary. There would be no report on this. No footage would capture the exact magnitude of what he'd tried to do. No tribunal, no press release, just consequences. The kind that arrive not with noise, but with knowledge. The kind that comes when your breath starts to feel heavier and your options collapse inward like paper in rain. And that's when Rick understood something deeper than authority. It wasn't that Ezra Maddox commanded respect. It was that the room reshaped itself around him. The world tilted to accommodate his silence. And Rick, who had built his entire sense of control on being the loudest, the first to escalate, had nothing left to wield. No voice, no threat, no ground. He had seen the Black Phoenix, and now he couldn't unsee it. And whatever happened next, it wouldn't be his choice. Rick's mind began fracturing beneath a weight of stillness, not because of chaos, but because of how little it took to unravel him. No raised voices, no lunging, just this this presence being here. His heart knocked like a fist behind his ribs. He blinked once. Twice. Still, the tattoo stared back at him from that pale wrist, the ink somehow darker now in the sunlight, like shadow-made flesh. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't. He was trained, certified, decorated, and yet everything about this moment screamed that his training didn't matter anymore. The policies in his mind had all gone mute. He searched for lines to draw, for protocols to cite, for something to permit him to move, to speak, to act. But they had abandoned him. His thoughts raced, half-formed, chaotic. Was this a test? A setup? Was this man even real? Had he lost his grip on reality? But the weight of the gun was real. The sweat clinging to his spine was real. The voice that had come through the phone, deadly and unimpressed, was real. The SUV, now like a shadow stretching across the edge of his vision, didn't vanish when he looked back at it. This was no illusion. In that moment, he remembered the warning again, clearer this time. "Don't look for his file," the lieutenant had once said, eyes hollowed by memory. "If you need a file to know who he is, it's already too late." Rick had laughed then, the kind of laugh men use to cover unease. But he wasn't laughing now. His lips barely moved. His jaw had gone tight. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, thick with the weight of what Rick could never undo. Every second stretched, not toward resolution, but toward surrender. Not a white flag, not a handshake, just acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that he had stepped into something far beyond procedure, something not governed by courts or chiefs or press briefings. The man across from him had outclassed him without movement, without escalation, and that was what destroyed Rick the most. There was no action to justify, no shot to explain, no report to write, only the fact that in this battle of presence, he was irrelevant. He thought of everything that had brought him to this second, the drills, the rules, the quiet confidence that his badge and his training gave him leverage in any situation. But here, with one tattoo, one glance, one wordless defiance, that confidence had been stripped to bone. He had no leverage. He had no presence. He had only his fear, and even that felt borrowed. His eyes burned. Not from tears, from exposure, from standing too close to something that should only be viewed from behind mirrored glass or redacted pages. He had pulled the curtain back. Now he couldn't unsee the truth it concealed. And what would he say later? That he'd met a man who didn't raise his voice but silenced a precinct? That a symbol on a wrist had made him question his career, his worth, his authority? Who would believe it? Who would care? Maybe that was the point. Ghost Commander didn't exist to be believed. He existed to end things, and Rick had been foolish enough to start something. He lowered the weapon not as a concession, not as peace. He lowered it because holding it longer would make the illusion worse. He lowered it because somewhere deep in the marrow of protocol he finally heard the buried line, "If you see him, back off." So he did, because Rick Dalton had seen him, and now Rick Dalton would never forget him. No footsteps followed, no voices called his name, no orders barked through his radio. The world resumed, unchanged on the surface, but Rick knew differently. Something fundamental had shifted, cracked under the weight of what he'd just encountered. In another hour, this road would look the same. The sun would still scorch the concrete, but Rick Dalton would never again be the man who stood on this line thinking he was in charge. That version of him had ended today. The silence Rick walked into wasn't truly silent. It was the kind that lives between systems, the kind that hums beneath frequencies when something massive shifts in places the eye can't see. He didn't speak when he crossed the precinct doors, didn't explain why his posture was looser, why his hand stayed too long at his side before setting the gun down. The front desk clerk opened his mouth to ask a question and closed it again without sound. Something in Rick's eyes made asking irrelevant. Upstairs, the hum of machines and the click of keyboards filled the dispatch center with its usual rhythm until it didn't. It started with a flicker. Not a bang, not a broadcast. A flicker, so fast that most didn't notice. One of the monitors in dispatch control, room 3B, blinked black for a half second, then came back with a timestamp error. No one moved, until the second screen did the same. Then a third. Dispatch Officer Morales frowned, tapping the glass like it might knock clarity back into the system. Camera 3 downtown just kicked. He's no answer. By the time he looked back, 2 more feeds were gone. At 10:41 a.m., a ping sounded. A single-line email popped into the central inbox. Subject, protocol freeze. Body, standby. Code Eagle/Black. There was no sender, no footer, no internal flag. Just black text on white. "What the hell is that?" someone asked. No one knew. Officer Jensen pulled up the code list. Most of them were color-coded per region jurisdiction. But Eagle/Black had no local match. His fingers moved, searching through clearance levels. Nothing. So he did what he wasn't supposed to. He ran it against federal archives. The moment he hit enter, the screen flooded with secondary data, routing IDs, Authorization tokens. Every field is locked. But one word blinked in red. Oregon. NORAD. Jensen blinked. That's gotta be wrong, he muttered, too loudly. NORAD's military. A silence followed. He stood up slowly, not because he was afraid, but because his body no longer trusted chairs. Guys, this isn't from internal. We've been frozen from the outside. Someone laughed, a short, sharp, nervous sound. Then another monitor died, then 3 more. The lights didn't dim. Phones didn't ring. But the system, the heart of their precinct, was bleeding out in real time. The main board that fed live street cameras now displayed black rectangles. The overlay UI read, "Access denied." Down the hallway, a door slammed. Chief Harvell stormed in, tie askew, sleeves half-rolled, eyes already looking for someone to blame. "What's happening?" he barked. Morales stood, holding a clipboard like it might protect him. "Sir, we got a freeze alert, outside source, NORAD clearance code." "Bullshit," Harvell spat. "Why the hell would NORAD hit us?" Jensen, still standing, eyes wide, held up his screen like it was a body. "Sir, it's not a drill. We're locked out, full override. I can't even ping the backup drives." Harvell's jaw worked silently, chewing air. Then he turned toward the terminal. "What about internal comms?" "Dead," said Morales. "Intranet just went red across all terminals. Phones? Jammed. Radio? Only static." Harvell stared at the black monitors as if he could will them back to life. Then he looked around at the room full of blinking faces. "Are we being watched by the goddamn military?" No one answered, because no one knew, and not knowing made it worse. That's when the final screen flashed. Not an alert, not a breach. Just one word across every black rectangle. Standby. That was it. No countdown, no context. Just standby, as if the entire building was now waiting for a message from a level they didn't know existed. Morales leaned forward, whispering like it might break the tension. "This isn't local anymore." The tension didn't roar, it didn't scream, it just thickened, wrapped around necks, crept into lungs, turned every spoken word into a question no one wanted to finish. The youngest officers froze at their desks. The veterans stopped pretending they had answers. Even the coffee stopped brewing. Someone reached for their cell phone. No signal. Another checked the wall clock. It hadn't stopped ticking, but it might as well have. Nothing made sense. Systems that weren't connected were now failing together, like dominoes that never should have touched. "Run diagnostics," Harvell snapped. Jensen did. His fingers flew, but the screens pushed back, one by one. "Can't get through. It's locked from the source. Our credentials don't exist anymore." Harvell's voice cracked through clenched teeth. "How the hell can our systems not recognize us?" Jensen didn't answer. No one did. They just stood there, watching the heartbeat of their station dissolve in quiet intervals. Somewhere deep in the system logs, a code string looped. Every tech-savvy officer in the room recognized one tag, Black Phonics Red. Morales caught it first and choked back a comment. They all knew what that meant, or at least what it was rumored to mean. It was never supposed to show up here, in a precinct server, in a city without clearance. It was a theoretical tag, used in simulations, something whispered about during federal briefings behind 2 sets of doors. And now it was here, like it had always been waiting. The whispers started, real ones. "This isn't about us. What the hell did Rick walk into? Are we part of a drill? Where's the order to evacuate?" But no evacuation came, no messages. The only thing that remained was stand by, blinking. Constant, unmoving. Harvell backed away from the main console, looked at the cluster of darkened feeds and frozen data trails, and finally said what everyone else already feared. "We're not running this anymore. They are." And then the strangest part. Nothing happened. No explosions. No second command, no hazmat teams or federal vans, just stillness, as if the entire network was holding its breath, waiting for someone else's cue. They were all pieces now, inactive, unarmed, on pause. The building wasn't attacked, but it had been taken, not with violence, with silence. With an order delivered through circuits too high for any of them to reach. Jensen sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the red lettering on the central screen. He remembered a briefing last year, some obscure cybersecurity overlap session, where a liaison from Homeland Security talked about operation, layers beyond state grasp. Most of them thought it was paranoia. Most laughed it off. But the language came back now, like a whisper, replayed inside his chest. You won't see the hand that freezes you, only the absence of motion after. Another tech officer in the back, Griggs, tried to connect to the off-grid storage archive. It rejected his credentials and replaced the screen with a pulsating waveform. Not an error, a signal, as if the system was listening. He turned pale, stepped back from the keyboard, and didn't say a word. Harvell watched him, then looked up. Nobody touches another terminal. Everyone froze. Morales, still closest to the blacked-out map wall, muttered, "It's like they're telling us not to think." The room vibrated, not from sound, from the weight of knowing. The illusion of independence had cracked, and what leaked out wasn't rebellion, it was realization. They were under control. And no badge, no chain of command, no SOP binder could change that now. From the hallway, footsteps echoed, not rushed, not armed, just measured. Someone coming, but not someone from inside. A message blinked on Morales' secondary screen. A new line. Not from their network, just text. One line. You are temporarily offline. Do not attempt to reconnect. Jensen read it aloud. His voice didn't shake, but his fingers did. Harvell stepped back from the board. The authority in his stance drained, not collapsed, but transferred. He wasn't in command now. He was under advisement. This wasn't a hijack. It was an occupation, and the building obeyed it without a fight. Outside, nothing looked unusual. The streets still shimmered under sunlight. Birds still circled high above the courthouse tower, and people walked to lunch unaware that the digital nerves of their protectors had been severed. Inside, the temperature hadn't changed, but everyone felt cold. No one said it, but they all knew. Their world had shifted, and not one of them had control over what came next. Harvell didn't pace anymore. He stood still, watching the screen with, "You are temporarily offline," blinking like a curse. No alarm sounded, no clarifying broadcast. The quiet persisted, the type that usually follows disaster, only this time there had been no blast, just erasure. Jensen finally whispered, "So this is what it looks like when they shut you down." Morales didn't answer. He just watched the last cursor blink into stillness and closed his laptop. They waited, every second dragging across bone, wondering if anyone would come, but no one did. The building didn't unlock, the signal didn't return, and so they stood there. Cops, dispatchers, techs, stripped of role, stripped of hierarchy, left only with the same blinking command that turned their authority into theater. Stand EB, and the world outside just kept turning. It began with pixels, not bullets. The video didn't come with context, credits, or commentary. It arrived raw, jagged, and terrifying in its simplicity. A white officer, Rick Dalton, frozen in a single posture, arm extended, gun aimed point-blank at a seated black man behind the wheel of a motionless car. No sound, no intro. Just that moment looped in silence, posted to a burner Twitter account at 7:14 a.m., retweeted 20,000 times. By 7:27, by 8:05, it had migrated to TikTok, sliced into reaction edits, paired with soundtracks that swung between outrage and irony. Instagram Reels turned it into a slow-motion theater. Reddit lit up first. The politics thread split within 30 minutes. Top comment, "This isn't policing. This is theater of intimidation." Reply beneath, "You weren't there. This is what happens when people don't obey." Another, "Y'all forgetting the badge don't come with judge-jury privileges." The video was labeled 10 different ways by 10 different factions. Another white cop threatening black life. Standard protocol during an unknown traffic stop. Manufactured outrage. This is what they want, to divide us. Then came the audio, a second clip. Shakier, filmed from the sidewalk by a woman in pink sandals who ducked behind a trash bin. It was grainy, off-gang, and terrible, but it had sound. And in that sound, Rick's voice cracked open. He wasn't composed, he wasn't calm. He was shouting, wild-eyed and unmistakably afraid. "Easy, my docs," he screamed. "Don't you move!" It was rage. It was fear. It was recognition wrapped in panic. The name dropped like an anchor into the collective feed. Google Trends spiked. Hashtags multiplied. Ezra Maddox became the question, the trigger, the fault line. An hour later, another voice entered the fray. Older, slower, broken but firm. It was a video posted from a porch somewhere in South Carolina. The man wore a U.S. Army cap, wrinkled hands gripping the armrests of a lawn chair. "Ezra Maddox isn't just a name," he said. "He's the man who pulled my squad out of Kandahar when Command left us to die. I owe him my life. So if you think he's some nobody you can just point a gun at, think again." The video reached 1 million views before noon. Veterans started weighing in. Most didn't give details. They didn't need to. Just a nod, just a look, just, "We remember." Then came the edits. A version surfaced showing Ezra stepping out of the car, but the lighting was off, the angle cleaner than any known footage. His movements were sped up slightly, and the audio carried phrases he hadn't spoken. "I am not afraid to use force," the clip claimed. "I don't answer to local law." It was a fabrication, but clean, engineered, and designed to provoke. The voice wasn't his. It was an AI-generated double, and it spread like fire. Before platforms could flag it, it had been mirrored, memed, remixed, and seeded into channels that never asked for proof. Twitter bled into broadcast. Cable news anchors scrambled for official statements, but nothing came. No badge cams released, no department press conferences, just split screens. On one side, Rick Dalton in freeze frame, gun raised. On the other, Ezra Maddox in fragments. Rumor, legacy, speculation. Panelists screamed over each other. One called Ezra a covert operative. Another said he was a rogue. A third insisted he was a target. A fourth, what if he's exactly what they trained him to be? And through it all, the comments kept coming. Some praised Rick for holding his line. Others called him a coward. Some wanted Ezra canonized. Others wanted him to be questioned. But no one agreed, because the truth had fractured. Somewhere in that noise, truth lost its footing. Everyone had their version of what happened, of who was right, of what Ezra Maddox meant. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Instagram reels flipped the narrative one way. YouTube think pieces flipped it the other. TikTok filters added music to Rick's face mid-scream, some comedic, others dark and mournful. Teenagers made edits with slow zooms and echo effects. Every view added distortion. Every upload birthed a new angle. By early evening, 2 politicians had issued contradictory statements. One called the event an outrageous example of bias and brutality, while the other warned of a dangerous individual whose background raises national security concerns. Neither mentioned context. Neither mentioned what the cameras missed. The agencies involved said nothing. No confirmation, no clarification, only silence. Ezra Maddox became a name without a face, both ghost and symbol, and Rick, caught in freeze frame, was both aggressor and artifact, a man trapped in a single second of bad decisions and worse consequences. More clips surfaced, some real, some doctored. A third angle showed Rick's partner stepping back, eyes wide. Someone overlaid captions. She knew, but they didn't hear her heartbeat. They didn't hear the silence in her breath. Another edit froze on Rick's sweating forehead, zoomed in on the panic behind his eyes. "Cowardice or consequence," read the headline. And still Maddox said nothing. No official statement, no appearance, no rebuttal. Only the silence of someone who didn't play by the same rules, didn't owe the same explanations, didn't traffic in public opinion. That silence, too, was dissected. If he's innocent, why doesn't he speak? If he's powerful, who's he hiding from? What does he know? A subreddit dedicated to decoding the clip reached 120,000 members. Frame-by-frame analysis. Threads full of enhanced audio, reflected license plate metadata, and signal interference anomalies. Some called it amateur journalism anomalies. Some called it an obsession, but no one stopped watching. They couldn't. Every screen in America now knew Rick's face. knew his voice when he screamed the name, knew his eyes when the world beneath him gave way, and they all knew Ezra Maddox, but differently. To some, he was a patriot, to others, a threat, to the rest, a myth rebooted by chaos. And at the bottom of every feed, beneath every stream, there was one caption that refused to go away. This is no longer about protocol. This is about who owns the narrative. Somewhere deep in a media control room, a producer scrolled through footage while murmuring, "We don't need the truth. We need traction." The sentiment echoed in every editorial meeting that day. Ezra became content. Rick became a consequence. Headlines rotated like slot machines. Former hero or present danger. Officer or overreactor. Ghost unit or deep state plant. Everyone needed a take. Everyone wanted clicks. No one wanted stillness. The clip was played in reverse, slowed down, and set to piano music. It aired on the nightly news with soft narration. It aired on right-wing channels with voiceovers dripping in contempt. It was debated on podcasts, quoted in think pieces, and reenacted in indie animations. Each retelling added something. Each version took something away, and Ezra remained silent. But then came the shift. A file surfaced. Brief, obscure, redacted. It wasn't officially released. It wasn't even verified. But it bore a seal, and that was enough. It mentioned Black Phoenix. It mentioned Ezra Maddox. It didn't explain, but it hinted. And hinting was gasoline. Newscasters gasped mid-sentence. Analysts stammered over charts. Someone mapped locations. Someone else did side-by-sides with historic footage. It didn't matter if it was real. It mattered that it could be. And so the clip evolved. It was no longer about Rick. Not really. He was the match. But Ezra was the fire. The question was no longer, did Rick go too far? But what happens when the system meets something it didn't design? That question made headlines. It made speeches. It lit up algorithms. People began to choose sides not based on facts, but on fear. Fear of lawlessness. Fear of control. Fear of the unknown, walking casually through a traffic stop. Ezra's silence became louder than Rick's scream, and yet no one had answers, only edits, only emotions. And through it all, that same banner ran beneath every news crawl, unconfirmed but unchallenged. This is no longer about protocol. This is about who owns the narrative, and nobody knew who that was anymore. Late that night, while timelines spun and algorithms refreshed faster than anyone could follow, the original clip replayed one more time. Just once. No commentary, no edits, no music. Just the image of Rick Dalton, gun trembling, eyes burning, and a still, silent man who never moved. No name, no angle, no cutaway. Just that moment. And for a fleeting second, it all made sense, before the scroll swallowed it whole again. Because in the end, the truth wasn't the loudest voice. It was the one that never needed to speak. The footage ended, but the silence didn't. In the hours that followed the leak, servers groaned under the weight of search queries, keywords, and speculation. Ezra Maddox became not just a name, it became a gateway into digital fog. Sometime past 2:00 a.m., buried beneath an obscure FTP relay in an unsecured metadata packet, a file surfaced, unnamed, unsorted, untimed. The header simply read A1RA/PH. The file was a zip, encrypted, then re-encrypted, then nested under dead routes and zero-point checksum headers. Once opened, by accident or by intent, it did not ask for a password. It opened itself. Document 1. Subject, Maddox. Ezra Maddox. Status, Black Delta Black. Rank, undisclosed. Allegiance, Black Phoenix. Operation count, redacted. Incident involvement, confirmed. Termination status, not authorized. Black Phoenix. 2 words that should not have existed outside of non-attributable field theory briefings. A unit built for maximum impact and zero footprint. Its existence was considered a rumor even in circles that classified rumors as real, yet the file bore the sigil, black wings folded over the numeric insignia 113. Beneath that, a single fragment, Commanding Agent. The timestamp was 11 years old. The font was NATO standard. The clearance tag was Alpha stratified, cross-keyed to Northcom. Document 4, embedded visual. Date stamp 12 Mar 14, Operation Eclipse Gate. Location Kandahar, AO-17. Content low-resolution tactical feed. Interior breach 11 targets, 4 hostages, 9 confirmed kills, 1 extraction, no masks. At 1:34 into the video, the camera shakes, refocuses, and catches a frame. Maddox is visible, not blurred, not concealed. He's standing in a burned corridor, rifle low. Sweat cutting a line down his left temple. The expression is unreadable. Not anger, not panic, calculation. At 1:38, he gives a hand signal. The entire corridor clears within 4 seconds. No radio chatter, no hesitation, just movement. Clean, controlled, surgical, like watching muscle memory perform war. At 2:11, he lifts one of the hostages, a child, onto his shoulder and walks into the smoke. That's where the feed ends. Document 7, operational testimony. Speaker, Escol. M. Rivers. Read by an ultra-film Akatpa. Maddox wasn't a field agent. He was in the field. When we sent him in, we weren't asking questions. We were ending chapters. Document 9, Internal Advisory, DoD. Effective immediately, under Article 9 Clearance Clause, Subject Ezra Maddox is not to be approached, detained, questioned, or followed under any standard civilian or federal protocol. All monitoring requests must be funneled through Command Echo. Do not initiate contact. Do not attempt surveillance. Do not reference Project Phoenix in official documentation. The language was dry, but beneath every word sat a current. This wasn't someone hiding. This was someone protected, someone built for use, then buried, then warned against. Across message boards and whisper threads, the file passed like a virus. Some called it a hoax. Others swore it explained everything. Some wept, some raged. Most didn't know how to process it. How do you frame a ghost in high definition? How do you classify something built to vanish? By noon, major outlets began referencing the leak. Carefully, conditionally. Alleged documents suggest involvement in Black Ops Group. Sources unconfirmed but striking. Pentagon silent. Behind closed doors, terminals were going dark. Requests scrubbed. Queries into Black Phoenix timed out. Several profiles, military and civilian, were quietly disabled. In one newsroom, an anchor refused to read from the prompter. "This guy's real," she said. "We've been living in a shadow war." Her mic was cut 30 seconds later. Elsewhere, a defense analyst whispered, "They told us ghosts don't exist. They never said they worked for us." That night, a private outlet posted the full Eclipse Gate footage, unwatermarked. It lasted 6 minutes. Ezra appeared in 4. In each, he moved without urgency. No flourish, no performance. Just motion honed by repetition. Violence taught to breathe. Then came Document 12. No classification, no preamble. Just 5 words at the top of a blank page. Do not engage this individual. Below it, a signature, illegible, digitally burned like a brand. Addendum 14. Behavioral deviation profile. The subject exhibits non-standard risk aversion. Known for entering high volatility scenarios solo. Rejected reinforcement 3 times during Operation Night Rain. Refused promotion to directorial staff. Chose instead to rotate through conflict theaters under alternate identification strings. Entry note. Command presence without command structure. Operates as perimeter, not participant. Internal email fragment. If he's surfaced now, it's not by mistake. Maddox doesn't trip over exposure. He triggers a revelation. If he's present, someone upstream authorized it. Or something worse, he overruled them. Document 7. Psychological profile. Assessment marked inconclusive. Notes. High strategic intelligence. Social masking is functionally perfect. Ethical framework unknown. Responds only to actionable threat recognition. Another note. This is not a soldier who follows orders. This is a directive weapon dressed as a man. Leaked message board transcript. Q14. I ran logistics for CENTCOM. I moved crates stamped with a Black Phoenix. We never logged the routes. E12. My buddy swears Maddox pulled him out of Fallujah. Wouldn't say more. Just said, he's not a man, He's an option. MOD. Thread lock for security. Document 19. International Watch List. Cross-reference. UN Security Sector lists biometric sightings under aliases. M. Esra, D. Mo, K. Resnor. All identities are marked deceased. Motion signature confirms 88% match. Note, presence correlates with event conclusion, not initiation. Broadcast transcript. Call-in show. Caller, my cousin worked recovery in Jordan. Said, sometimes Maddox didn't carry weapons. He was the weapon. What's he doing now? Caller, what he always does. He watches. Then he decides. Within 24 hours, the Department of Defense issued a top-secret memo. Cease all analysis of codebase tied to Phoenix Black. No personnel may verify legacy operators without command clearance. Breach equals hostile investigation. Media speculation ceased, not from lack of interest, but from pushback. Panel invitations revoked. Researchers lost access. Search results are being throttled. One article vanished mid-screen. The podcast disappeared. The name Maddox stopped trending, not because it lost relevance, but because someone capped the pressure. Document 22. External Affairs Memo. If Maddox becomes a point of discourse, do not acknowledge, confirm, or deny. Every inquiry is monitored. Redirect to liaison. No response is also a response. Still, the clip moved. The one from Kandahar. No mask, no filter. A man framed by gunfire and silence, lifting civilians without fanfare, vanishing into dust. Addendum 23. Ghosts aren't born, they're built. Ezra Maddox is not a rogue. He is the result. He had not spoken, but the world called him back anyway. Now he was no longer a rumor. He was recorded, and record changes everything. Addendix 25. Executive Summary Flag. Appendix 25. Archive all mentions under Cipher Ghostwalk. Special Advisor Commentary. He's not outside the system. He's what happens when the system's edge stops needing permission. By then, the clip had been flagged and removed. Not deleted, just buried. Beneath legal reach. But it still moved. Offline drives, burner lines. Whispers were rank, lost meaning. The final page bore no conclusion, no signature, just a blank space, perhaps intentional, or perhaps waiting for the next invocation, the next crossing of the line, the next moment when what waited wasn't a drone, wasn't a file, wasn't even a warhead, but a man whose silence was sharper than any bullet. And so the report closed, not with a name, but with a silence. The silence that closed the Maddox report did not end in the shadows. It spilled into chambers lit with old brass and older ambitions. By 9 o'clock I-minimum, the city council convened under emergency protocol. The name Ezra Maddox was not on the docket. It did not need to be. Everyone knew what this was. Not a hearing, not a decision, a reckoning. 17 officials in a room built for speeches now sat quiet, because what needed saying couldn't be softened by procedure. The room was hot, not with temperature, with history. The kind that hangs from the walls like portraits. No one questions anymore. Councillor Vance cleared his throat, the sound of politics trying to find a posture. "We're here," he began, "to determine appropriate response to the viral footage and the response, or lack thereof, from federal channels." Someone scoffed, a woman in a navy blazer. Councillor Aldridge, "You mean we're here to play the illusion of authority while the Pentagon writes our silence?" A gavel tapped, not to restore order, but to remind them who held it. The mayor, seated, didn't speak yet. His eyes weren't on the council. They were fixed on the lone man standing against the wall, a department liaison in a black tie and a face that looked carved rather than born. In front of him was a sealed envelope with a crimson stripe. It was unopened, but everyone in the room already felt what it contained. Councillor Rivas spoke next, measured but laced with tension. "The footage implicates Officer Dalton. Excessive force, a lapse in judgment that cannot be ignored. And yet," interrupted Councillor Singh, "there's no movement from internal affairs, no motion filed. Because no one wants to touch this," someone muttered. "No one wants the first fingerprint on the box marked Maddox." Then came the sentence that splintered the room. Councillor Beale, sharp-suited, voice razor-clean, said flatly, "I propose we move to suspend Officer Rick Dalton pending federal review." The air changed, not exploded, curled, as if everyone inhaled and forgot how to let go. The proposal did not fall, it hovered. It hung in the chamber like a blade suspended by implication. The mayor didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He leaned back slowly, letting the silence bloom. Councilor Kim finally broke it. "You want to suspend an officer in the middle of a national firestorm when we don't even know who he pulled over? We know enough," Bill snapped. "We know he pulled a gun without provocation. We know he shouted like a cornered animal. We know what the city saw. And the city saw a man do what men like him have always done," said a voice from the back. All heads turned to Councilor Therese Holloway. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Every syllable landed like a judge's verdict. "This isn't about Rick Dalton. This is about what he represents." The chamber held still. "We have trained our officers to act without hesitation, then punish them for forgetting how to think. We have groomed a culture of fear, and now we act shocked when fear pulls the trigger." Councilor Miles, the youngest on the board, shifted in his seat. "You're saying we do nothing?" "I'm saying we stop pretending this is just a PR crisis," Holloway replied. "I'm saying we look in the mirror and admit this was designed." The liaison in the black tie moved for the first time. Without a word, he walked to the podium and slid the envelope forward. The mayor opened it. 1 page, 10 words. "The Department of Defense advises that no action be taken against Ezra Maddox." It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't advice, it was an order veiled in the politest ink. No one asked what authority issued it, no one needed to. The mayor read it aloud anyway, his voice even, almost curious. "No action, not even a comment?" The liaison nodded once. "We're being told to do nothing," muttered Aldridge, "to not even speak his name." "Because they know," said Holloway, "that once you name a ghost, you owe it a reckoning." Councilor Patel leaned forward. "If we suspend Dalton, we admit he acted improperly. If we don't, we endorse everything he did. Or," Miles added, "we admit we've lost control. That real power no longer answers to rooms like this." Outside the chamber, protesters gathered, not chanting, just waiting, holding signs that read like verdicts. Some said Rick, some said Ezra, most said nothing changes until everything breaks. Councilor Kim checked his phone. "It's national," he said. "We're trending second behind a missile launch." Aldridge hissed, "This is a missile launch." Then Holloway stood again. She didn't speak to the council. She spoke to the record. "I want this entered clearly. The issue at hand is not one man. It is not one bullet not fired. It is a system designed to justify its brutality, and shocked to find itself on camera. Rick Dalton is not an anomaly. He is a mirror. And what terrifies you is that, for once, the mirror did not break. It stared back. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of speech. It was the kind that stripped a room of excuses, the kind that rewrote memory. The mayor closed the folder and passed it back. "Then let the record reflect. We are not voting on Officer Dalton at this time, and we are not, under any circumstances, issuing a comment on Ezra Maddox." The gavel dropped, not to signal order but surrender. In that moment the council bowed, not to a man, not a threat, to something more unshakable, the fear that power had shifted, and none of them knew who held it anymore. That night, the footage of the council meeting leaked, not from an official source, but from the cracked phone of a junior aide who couldn't stop recording. It wasn't the vote that mattered. There wasn't one. It was the faces. Faces of power, trapped between fear and calculation, bathed in institutional lighting that could not conceal moral erosion. It spread fast. Not viral, but viral enough. On one corner of the internet, Rick Dalton was being lionized as the last line of order. On another, he was a fossil of a dying institution. But neither side mentioned Ezra. They didn't need to. His name had passed from person to person. In forums, he was a test. In policy rooms, a variable. In intelligence circles, a trigger clause is used in new briefings. No one had seen him, no one had heard him, but he was present in every pause, in every hedged sentence. In every moment a leader looked into the lens and chose silence. By morning, strategists had reworded everything. Not a decision, a delay, not surrender, strategic patience. But Holloway's words lived louder than any memo. They played again and again. What terrifies you is that for once the mirror did not break. It stared back. And across the country, other mirrors began to turn. In schools, in stations, in courts. None of them broke. They stared, and those who had always looked away finally saw what had been there the entire time. Not a man, but a moment, and would not blink first. 3 days later, a civic newsletter published a timeline titled The Collapse of Accountability. It didn't name names. It didn't need to. It simply listed moments. A gun was raised. A name was shouted. A command obeyed. A command defied. A council was silenced. A city stalled. A speech was erased. A man who never spoke, but still turned the whole structure sideways. At the end of the timeline, there were no conclusions. Only one final line in bold. This isn't about who has the power. It's about who refuses to use it. In a country drowning in noise, that line cut through. And in every room that mattered, no one could say they didn't hear it. The mirror had refused to break. But now it reflected something worse. Truth, uncut and late. 3 days after the council bowed to silence, the silence broke. It came from the dash cam of a patrol unit, filed under routine incident footage, never reviewed, never flagged, until it was. A freelance journalist, unnamed but known on encrypted boards for finding what others missed, obtained the raw feed. She didn't edit it, didn't narrate, just uploaded it with one title. From inside the car. The footage began like every other clip. Heat haze, light glare, radio fuzz. But 37 seconds in, it shifted. A figure moved into frame. Rick Dalton. Not as the officer reported. Not as the council framed him. But as he truly was. Hand trembling, voice cracking. Eyes lit with something, not fear, not duty, but he was leaning into the window of the black car. The man inside, Ezra Maddock, still didn't speak, didn't flinch, but the footage caught a detail the original video missed. Rick's finger, pressed tight against the trigger guard, unmoving, not hesitant, committed. The internet didn't explode. It inhaled. Every comment, every repost, came with the same stunned tone. He was going to do it. And then came the scream, unfiltered, unspliced. "You think I'm scared of that goddamn phone?" Rick's voice shattered across the speakers. "You think I give a damn who you call?" In the corner of the shot, the junior officer, the young woman, reached for Rick. Her face was soaked. She was crying, whispering something. Inaudible, but a plea. Rick didn't hear it, or chose not to. Then came the moment that no one forgot. She grabbed his shoulder, not to stop him, to save him. He turned and shoved her off, not with rage, with contempt. As if her fear disgusted him, as if her doubt was betrayal. The shove was hard enough to rock her into the side of the patrol vehicle, and all the while the finger stayed curled around the trigger. Maddox still didn't move. The video ran for 6 minutes and 13 seconds. It needed less than half of that to rewire everything. By the 2-minute mark, viewers weren't watching Rick Dalton anymore. They were witnessing the unraveling of authority dressed in uniform. Not fear. Not protection. Pure, unfiltered escalation. His body language was a catalog of control lost. Jaws clenched too tight, shoulder rigid, feet rooted in threat posture, not protocol. The finger on the trigger never relaxed, never drifted, never forgot it was there. By the end of the footage, it wasn't a matter of whether Rick had broken protocol. It was whether the badge he wore had ever meant anything else. The comments came fast. Not just from the public, but from within the badge. Officers, anonymous and not, former captains, current trainers, and silent supervisors are finally stepping into the frame. "This isn't policing," one wrote. "It's projection with a weapon." Another, "He shoved her. She was crying. She wasn't scared of the suspect, she was scared of him." The journalist who posted the clip gave an interview. Just one. She didn't appear on screen, her voice was modulated. She said, "I didn't find this. It was already there, buried in public access, labeled wrong, ignored on purpose." When asked what it proved, she didn't answer. She didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any press conference ever could. It was Rick unmasked not by hackers or whistleblowers, but by the very system he had believed would protect him. The shift in public perception was not gradual. It was violent in its velocity. Media that had blurred Rick's face now displayed it in crystal clarity. Debates moved from, was he justified, to, what else has he done? Old records resurfaced, archived footage, previous stops. A trend, a tone. The pattern was unmistakable. The most damning reactions weren't viral threads or influencer takedowns. They were from within the walls Rick once walked. A former academy instructor posted a single line. We taught him to de-escalate. He chose dominance. A retired precinct captain shared the footage with his comment. He's not broken, he was built this way. That's the problem. Internal Affairs, under pressure from both public and federal watchers, reopened prior cases. Files marked as unsubstantiated began to bleed into relevance. Incidents dismissed as misunderstandings now screamed context. When the clip reached Maddox, because of course it did, no one knew what he said, or if he said anything. But the silence around him felt sharper than ever. It wasn't an absence, it was insulation. He remained untouched, unreadable, and unbothered. It was not his face that burned across the feeds. It was Rick's. Maddox wasn't the story anymore. He was the measure. Rick was the reckoning. The junior officer, her name was finally confirmed as Emily Shore, was approached by 3 networks for interviews. She declined all, but her written statement, submitted quietly to a small nonprofit legal group, said enough. I was trained to follow command. But when I saw his hand shake, when I heard his voice crack, I knew I wasn't backing a badge. I was backing a loaded gun with a frayed fuse. Her words were printed on posters, quoted in courtrooms, whispered in precinct locker rooms. The clip didn't just shift perception, it detonated it. Commentators stopped debating, they started confessing. One host wept live on air. I defended this guy. I defended that look in his eyes. I said it was stress, but stress doesn't shove your partner. Stress doesn't aim to kill without a word from the other side. In classrooms, professors stopped mid-lecture to show the footage. Ethics courses replaced case studies with Rick's freeze frame. Law academies debated the trigger pressure caught on camera. Rick Dalton's defenders thinned, then evaporated. And still the camera did not blink, because it never had. Rick Dalton, once framed by sympathetic light and institutional loyalty, now stood beneath the harshest spotlight of all, unedity reality. The footage played over and over, not as a clip, but as a cultural wound. Each replay peeled something back. The angle of his stance, the tremor in his jaw, the disdain as he shoved the only ally who tried to stop him. Forensic analysts began studying the footage, not just for legality, but for psychology. You can see it, one expert wrote. The moment ego disintegrates into power lust. Editorials pivoted. Articles titled, A Cop Under Pressure were rewritten to When Authority Turns on Itself. Independent reporters tracked down prior incidents that Rick had buried beneath paperwork and privilege. A stop in 2016 that nearly turned fatal. A complaint filed by a Latinx father dismissed as non-critical. The dominoes didn't fall. They combusted. One night, a student group projected the frame of Rick's finger on the trigger across the facade of the police academy. Beneath it the words, how many others? They didn't need a permit. They had the footage. And that was permission enough. Still, not everyone surrendered. A few voices tried to salvage him. He was pushed too far. Protocol wasn't clear. You weren't in his shoes, but the footage didn't flinch. The footage didn't blink. And no amount of retroactive justification could undo what had been caught. A man ready to kill, not because he had to, but because he could. When Internal Affairs finally issued a formal review, they included the phrase, pattern of escalating behavior. But the public had moved past review. They wanted a reckoning. The footage had taught them something courts hadn't. that truth could be silent until the moment it was recorded, and Rick, for all his shouts and threats, had finally been silenced by a lens. The tipping point wasn't legal, it was emotional. People didn't just watch the clip, they felt watched by it, as if the footage turned the lens outward, forcing everyone who had ever justified a glance away to stare into something undeniable. A teacher in Houston canceled her history syllabus for a week and asked her students to write essays titled, "The Day the Camera Didn't Lie." A preacher in Detroit projected Rick's frozen image onto the wall behind his pulpit. "God saw this," he said, but he waited for the camera because he knew you wouldn't believe him until it blinked. When Rick Dalton was called to appear before a departmental review panel, he walked in wearing the same boots he'd worn during the traffic stop, as if trying to remind someone, maybe himself, that he'd once stood on firmer ground. He did not speak, not because he was advised to stay silent, because no one wanted to hear it anymore. There was nothing he could say that the footage hadn't already screamed. And what of the young officer? Emily Shore. She requested reassignment, quietly, without fanfare. Her only public statement came in the form of a handwritten letter posted on a bulletin board inside a precinct's break room. "We're not just shaped by what we survive," it read. "We're shaped by what we allow. I allowed too much." The letter was photographed, copied, and shared. It became a screensaver, a bumper sticker, a warning, a vow. By the end of the week, no one remembered when Rick Dalton was a hero, but they remembered every second of what he almost became. The frame, the finger, the shove, the scream, the silence, the lens, and most of all, what it exposed. Because the camera didn't blink, but the country finally did. No siren announced his arrival. No badge cleared his entry. No invitation preceded his step. Ezra Maddox walked into the precinct like smoke through a crack in the wall. Slow, silent, unstoppable. The front desk officer didn't ask for ID, didn't ask for rank. She saw the man, saw the eyes, and picked up the phone. "He's here." She didn't say who. She didn't have to. The call reached the second floor, then the third. By the time Rick Dalton's name was summoned to the conference room, no one asked why. They only watched. He walked with a stiffness that betrayed him, like a man dragging rusted armor across a battlefield already lost. No one offered a chair. No one met his eyes. When the door closed, the room didn't go quiet. It went hollow. It swallowed sound. Ezra stood at the far end, hands at his sides, not folded, not fisted, still, like judgment waiting for breath. Rick stepped in and tried to square his shoulders, but the movement collapsed mid-chest. Ezra didn't look at him, not yet. His voice arrived before his gaze. "I didn't come here to ask for anything." The tone was not calm, it was carved. Rick said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't betray more than it saved. Ezra looked up, and the contact was contact like steel on stone. "I came so you understand. Not everyone stays silent because they're afraid." The sentence didn't rise. It landed, heavy, flat, final. It rang through the bones of every man in that room like a dropped badge on marble. Rick flinched, just slightly, just enough, and then he bowed his head. Not because he wanted forgiveness, not because he felt shame, because he feared what it meant for someone to see him break. There were 10 people in the room, not counting Ezra or Rick, supervisors, captains, IA officers. No one breathed too deeply. The air was disciplined, controlled. Rick remained standing, his hands hovering inches from his belt, unsure whether to posture or surrender. Ezra didn't fill the room. He narrowed it. The walls leaned inward with every word left unsaid. No one offered him a seat. He didn't need one. Lieutenant Graves, head of internal affairs, cleared his throat, but only because silence was pressing too hard on the lungs. "Mr. Maddox," he began, "we weren't expecting—" "I don't care," Ezra said, not loud, not sharp, just like someone is tired of waiting for the world to catch up. "I'm not here for your agenda, or your optics, or your apology letters waiting for a signature." No one moved. Even Graves nodded, as if the authority had shifted without needing paperwork. Rick's throat moved, a swallow. His voice followed. Brittle. "Why now?" Ezra's eyes flicked toward him, not in anger but with the weight of someone measuring what had already been measured too many times, because silence has limits. Ezra walked forward, not aggressive, just direct, a slow mechanical gravity. Every step recalibrated the hierarchy in the room. You thought I wouldn't respond, that I'd vanish again, fade. Like last time. Rick didn't answer. He couldn't. The room was too thick with memory. Ezra stopped 2 feet away. You don't understand the power of silence, Dalton. You think it's submission. You think quiet means consent. His gaze was surgical now, but silence is a choice, and I made mine. I chose to watch. Rick shifted, defensive. You don't know what it's like. Ezra cut him with a single breath. I know exactly what it's like. That's why I'm here. Ezra didn't raise his voice, because he didn't need volume. His presence was already turned up to maximum. You acted like you were alone out there, like no one saw. But you were never alone, Dalton. You were always seen. You just didn't believe anyone had the strength to speak. Rick looked down, not because of guilt, because the floor was easier than eye contact. What do you want from me? He muttered. Nothing, Ezra said, almost like a whisper. This isn't a transaction. There's nothing I need, only something you needed to hear. And now you have. Ezra stepped back, not in retreat, in conclusion, as if his message didn't require follow-up. He turned toward the door, and that's when Rick did something no one expected. He took a step forward, just one, like a man trying to reclaim dignity through proximity. I thought I was right, Rick said, barely louder than a thought. I thought people like you didn't think, Ezra snapped, turning his head just enough for the side profile to feel like a sword. You followed fear. You wrapped it in protocol and called it duty, but underneath, it was just fear. The door opened. Ezra walked out, and only then did the room start breathing again. Chairs creaked, spines straightened. Graves exhaled like someone resurfacing. No one spoke, because whatever language existed before Ezra walked in felt inadequate now. Rick remained standing, alone, still trying to calculate what part of him had broken in that room, and what part had been broken long before. In the hallway, no one stopped Ezra. Officers turned away. The desks fell silent as he passed. The building didn't clear a path for him. It simply refused to be in his way. Outside, the sky didn't shift, but the air tasted different, like something had been drained or revealed. He didn't look back. He never did. In the days that followed, no memo documented the encounter. No press release quoted it. No transcript was released. But word spread faster than any briefing, not because Ezra had said much, but because Rick had said nothing that mattered. What broke through the department wasn't a scandal. It was clarity, that someone outside their system had walked through its strongest doors and didn't need permission, that someone had held a mirror and no one liked what they saw. Rick didn't return to work the next day, or the next. His desk remained untouched, like a crime scene sealed in hesitation. Officers walked past it without comment, like it had become part of the building, a fixture of what had once been power. Emily Shore passed it twice. She never looked toward the chair, but both times her stride slowed by half a second. Ezra wasn't seen again. Not at the precinct, not in the press, not online. But his absence was louder than most headlines. His name returned to whispers, not out of fear, but because everyone understood now. He didn't speak unless the silence earned it, and the silence had earned it. In precincts across the country, his name appeared in briefings. If encountered, observe. Do not engage. But even those lines were fading, because Maddox wasn't meant to be encountered. He was meant to be Rick, meanwhile, sat in his apartment, curtains drawn, laptop shut down. The voice in his head wasn't Ezra's. It was his own, repeating the words, the ones that stuck like a thorn in the soft part of the mind. Not everyone stays silent because they're afraid, and every time he heard it, he heard the rest. Some of us watch, and we wait. And Rick knew now. He had been watched. He had been weighed, and he had not been worth silence anymore. Later that year, when cadets at the academy were asked to list defining moments in American law enforcement history, someone mentioned Ferguson. Someone else said Rodney King. Then one voice from the back of the room said, the day Ezra walked in. No one laughed. No one corrected him. The instructor paused, then nodded once and moved on. And just like that, it entered the canon, not as a riot, not as a scandal, but as a stillness so absolute it shifted the weight of an entire room. And if you asked any officer who had been there that day to describe what Ezra said, they could quote it word for word. But if you asked them what it felt like, they wouldn't have the language. Because some reckonings don't use words, they use gravity. And once you've stood in that kind of gravity, you don't forget the way your spine remembered how to bow. It didn't start with a headline. It started with a name, quiet, buried, and misspelled on purpose. A junior reporter with a stubborn streak and an expired City Hall badge found it while digging through disciplinary logs for a podcast segment that was never supposed to matter. Her eyes skimmed, paused, then narrowed. It was there. An internal complaint was filed in 2015 against Officer Rick Dalton. Allegation: excessive force, ethnicity of complainant, Latinx male, status, closed, classification, unsubstantiated, reviewer, unknown. But the reporter, Lena Cho, didn't stop because something about the paperwork didn't line up. The timing, the language, the silence. She requested access to prior filings. Denied. So she went off record. She made calls at hours, only to get guilty answers. She bought coffee for the records clerks who'd never been asked their names. One of them, an old man with cracked glasses and nicotine fingers, finally whispered, "You're looking for the one in the red folder." She found it on microfilm, misfiled under an old case number no longer linked to any living database. And then she saw the signature, E. Maddox. The air left her lungs. It wasn't confirmation. It was an implication, because the letter had never been validated. It had been marked anonymous, dismissed, buried, erased, but now unearthed. The handwriting was crisp, surgical. The language was colder than any plea. It didn't ask for justice. It documented failure, and it ended with a sentence that vibrated off the paper like a warning. He will do it again. Rick Dalton had always believed he'd buried his worst days behind a wall of bureaucracy and indifference. But the wall had cracked, and through that fracture, the past didn't crawl, it walked, in wearing a badge of its own. Lena published nothing, not yet. What she had wasn't a story. It was a live wire. She sent the files to a lawyer first, then a civil rights foundation, then, quietly, to a former detective who now taught ethics at a state university. Their reactions came back fast, then slow. Fast with horror, slow with advice. Be careful. He's insulated. The department will circle its wagons. And still, Lena pushed. In a dark-paneled interview room, she confronted Captain Mallory, a man who had overseen internal review boards for nearly 2 decades. He sat with hands clasped, gaze flat, voice like gravel soaked in varnish. That complaint was buried, he admitted, because someone upstairs said it was a dead end. No ID, no formal contact. They said it was just someone lashing out, Lena pressed. Did anyone try to find the sender? Mallory looked away. It was 2015, he said. Things were different then. He signed it, she replied. You had a name. He didn't respond, because everything that needed answering was already on the page. Later, off the record, another officer leaned in and said, "We all saw that letter. We just didn't think anyone outside the system ever would." And then, quietly, "We put it in a locked drawer. Red tab, no digital trace. We thought it would be forgotten." But Ezra Maddox hadn't forgotten. He hadn't even forgiven. He had waited, and now his name returned, not with noise, but with weight. Rick Dalton's name was called back into the system, not for commendation, but for consequence. Not in court, not yet, but in memory, in conversation, in every private email chain that tried to understand what went wrong and realized the answer had been filed away 10 years ago under E. Maddox in red. The fallout didn't begin with Lena's report. It began with the document itself leaking, an image of the original complaint, time-stamped, signed, scanned from the red folder. It appeared on message boards, then in group chats, then in formal HR inboxes across departments nationwide. Someone had copied the file. Someone had distributed it. The margins were annotated. One line circled in pen. He will do it again. The internet did not hesitate. Hashtags bloomed. Red folder, M-ad, forgotten but filed. Articles surfaced about similar complaints against Rick that never made it past review. Some from the academy, some from traffic stops in undocumented neighborhoods, all unproven, all unresolved, until now. Rick's photo reappeared, no longer grainy, no longer framed in blue and gold. Now it was the freeze frame of his finger on the trigger, paired beside the scanned signature of E. Maddox. Journalists ran timelines, activists ran petitions, city council members ran out of ways to explain. Ezra said nothing. He didn't post, didn't comment, he didn't need to. The weight of the truth didn't come from what was said. It came from what had been written down and ignored. The paper had outlived the lie. Inside the precinct, the red folder had been quietly removed from the drawer weeks before. No one knew who, or perhaps everyone did and chose not to ask. But the gap it left was louder than the evidence itself, a void where accountability had once been requested, denied, and forgotten. Eventually, Lena published the story, not with flair, not with fire, just facts, cold, unavoidable. The headline was simple, the complaint that predicted everything. Within minutes, it was syndicated. Within hours, it was national. Cable news debated its implications, but no one could spin the timestamp. No one could dispute the name. The past had paperwork now. Rick's name resurfaced in places that once praised him. Internal memos, training presentations, media retrospectives. Not as a case study in valor, as a case study in rot. Former colleagues were asked for comment, most declined. A few didn't. We all saw signs, said one. But the machine doesn't reward prevention. It rewards silence. And Rick, he didn't speak, couldn't, because his voice was no longer the loudest part of his history. His record was. Ezra Maddox's signature became something more than evidence. It became an indictment, not of one man, but of the system that looked away, that measured credibility by uniformity instead of truth. The fact that the complaint had been dismissed for being anonymous, while signed with the name of a man the government itself would later mark as untouchable, was the final irony. It wasn't just oversight, it was blindness with teeth. In legal circles, the document was referred to as Exhibit 0. The moment the department was warned and refused to listen. The moment Rick Dalton's future was foretold, not by a prophet, but by a soldier who knew exactly what he was seeing. And now the world saw it too. For once, they didn't turn the page. They turned back, and they read every line. Academic panels started citing the case, not just as misconduct, but as erasure. Textbooks reprinted excerpts from the original letter, highlighting the line, "He will do it again," as both evidence and elegy. At protests, that phrase became a chant. At lectures, it opened slide decks. At press conferences, it closed speeches. It wasn't just about Rick anymore. It was about everyone who had ever placed a red tab in a drawer and walked away. Lena was invited to speak. She declined. She had no interest in being the story. She had found it, yes, but it had existed long before her, waiting to be seen. And Maddox, he was nowhere. No statement, no comment. Just a lingering echo in systems that had once considered him a shadow. Now they treated him like a verdict, and Rick, he faded. Not dramatically, not in disgrace, just in absence. A resignation letter was mailed, unopened for 3 days. When the chief finally slid the envelope, there was no explanation, just one sentence. "I thought I had buried it," and under that one more, turns out it remembered how to breathe. Somewhere in the Northwest, at a modest police station built from brick and blame, a rookie officer opened a drawer marked Archive Red. She paused, fingers hovered. She thought about that story, the one her instructor couldn't stop referencing. About the drawer that had once held a letter no one read, the name no one spoke, the warning no one heeded. She didn't open the file, not yet. She just stared at it because she knew now. This was what consequence looked like before it had a voice. And the voice, it had signed with a single letter and a last name that never needed to speak twice, Maddox. She stared at the drawer marked red and didn't open it. Across the city, Rick Dalton was opening something else, a bottle, his third of the night. The liquor didn't blur his thoughts, it sharpened them to a jagged edge, and with that edge, he cut through the last thread of restraint he had left. He didn't dress, he didn't check the time, he didn't call. He just got in his car, barefoot, breath sour with bourbon and regret, and drove toward the house of the man whose name now swallowed his own. The street was dark, suburban, asleep, but the drunk never respects sleep. Rick stumbled out of his car and onto the walkway like a wounded animal seeking the fire that burned it. He reached the porch, didn't knock, just yelled. "Maddox!" His voice cracked, raw, hoarse, the sound of pride clawing at the walls of collapse. Porch lights flicked on around him, curtains parted, and Rick, knowing he had an audience now, lifted his arms like a preacher at war with his God. "I know who you are," he shouted. "You're not some ghost, you son of a bitch. You're not a hero. You're a brand. A piece of propaganda some suit printed to shut people up." He swayed, not just from drink, but from the gravity of saying out loud what his ego had whispered in secret for years. "You think you scare me? You think your silence makes you clean?" A door opened somewhere down the street. A phone camera blinked red. The live stream began. Ezra didn't appear, not at first, but the neighborhood did. A teenager across the street switched from selfie mode to front cam. A middle-aged woman whispered, "That's him, that's the cop," while her husband locked their front door. Rick didn't care. He pointed at the house, shouting words he barely strung together. "You ruined me. You think you're better? You think you're clean? You're just a story someone else wrote." The porch light clicked on. Not Ezra, just light. But it was enough. Rick turned toward it like it had answered. "You don't get to disappear," he barked. "You don't get to stay quiet while they make you a myth." He stepped closer, slurring. "You're just another name. Just another lie they sell to make people forget ours." No reply. Just silence, clean as ash. And then a neighbor muttered loud enough for a mic to catch, "This is sad." Another replied, "No, it's expected." By the time the clip hit Twitter, it had already been clipped, filtered, and overlaid with captions. "Disgraced officer confronts ghost of his failure." It wasn't the words that caught on, it was the frame. Rick Dalton, barefoot, badge still clipped to his belt, spitting into a Ring camera while the house didn't even open. The silence had more dignity than he did. The stream was viewed over 3 million times by sunrise. The call came at 7:12 a.m. Internal affairs, not disciplinary, not formal, just a short meeting request with a short subject line. Reputation Integrity Review. Rick showed up in the same jacket from the night before, still unshaven, still unaware that shame could smell like bourbon and sweat. The deputy chief didn't raise his voice. He just slid the paper across the desk. "You're being relieved of duty, effective immediately." Rick looked down. One hand moved to his chest, not in resistance but reflex. The badge sat heavy against his ribs. He unclipped it slowly, laid it on the table. It clinked like a coin dropped into a well. Not a sound of closure, a sound of abandonment. The deputy spoke without looking at him. "It's not about guilt. It's about weight. That badge can't carry yours anymore." When Rick left the office, he didn't take the badge. He left it on the table like something too toxic to hold. Outside, the precinct air felt thinner. Not like freedom, like fallout. The faces he passed didn't glare. They didn't comfort. They just averted, as if shame had a scent that lingered, and no one wanted it on their clothes. Rick got in his car and sat, not to drive, to breathe. But even that felt like theft now. Across the city, the clip had mutated. Some added music, somber piano. Others, mockery. A TikTok trend emerged, Rick rants, teens pretending to scream at motionless houses. But the core remained. He had gone to confront a man who never had to answer, and ended up revealing everything about himself, not in blood, in posture, in tone, in silence. Ezra, as usual, issued no response. No press, no counterstatement, but someone in his neighborhood posted a still image from their security feed. The caption was simple. "Sometimes not answering is the loudest thing you can do." It went viral. Not because it was clever, because it was true. And Rick, he woke the next day not to alarm, but to absence. No uniform, no shift schedule, just notifications. Thousands. He didn't open them. He knew what they said. He turned off the phone, laid it next to his badge on the kitchen counter. It was still there. He hadn't turned it in, just removed it. But the metal didn't gleam anymore. It looked dull, greasy, sweated on, as if it absorbed the failure it once symbolized. By noon, someone from the union called, not to fight, just to clarify. "This isn't disciplinary," they said. "This is reputational quarantine." Rick laughed, a sound that didn't climb. It just collapsed. "They are ashamed," he muttered. "They are ashamed I did it in public." "No," the voice corrected gently. "They're ashamed. It looked like the truth." He didn't argue, because that's exactly what it had looked like, and even he couldn't unsee it anymore. The days that followed were not filled with outrage. They were filled with forgetting. Rick's name no longer trended. The badge, once his identity, became a prop in social commentary. A sketch show mocked the moment he screamed at the porch light. A late-night host used the footage as a punchline and parable. "Moral of the story," he said, "don't bring bourbon to a battle with your past." But in quieter corners, something else happened. Rookie officers were shown the clip in training rooms. Not to shame, but to warn. "Watch the hands," one instructor said. "Not his fists. The twitch. That's not aggression. That's a man unraveling." They didn't mention Ezra by name. They didn't have to. His absence was the curriculum. Rick, meanwhile, avoided mirrors. Not from guilt, but from futility. There was nothing left to adjust. He stayed indoors, shades drawn, blinds half closed. Not hiding, just untethered. One night he picked up the badge again. Not to wear, just to weigh. It was cold. Slick. He stared at it for an hour before placing it in the freezer, like something that had spoiled, something that had sweat. He never touched it again, because some metals don't rust. They rot, and when they do, they take the hand that held them with them. A month later, the badge was found in the freezer by the landlord. Rick had vacated the apartment, left no forwarding address, no belongings, just the badge, encased in frost, sealed in a Ziploc bag. The note beside it wasn't bitter, it wasn't even signed. Just 6 words printed in uneven Sharpie. "I thought I'd cooled it off." The photo of that frozen badge made it to the front page of a newspaper. It didn't spark debate, it didn't change policy, but for those who had ever worn one, it hit differently, because it wasn't destroyed. It wasn't discarded. It was preserved, like a relic of a man who once thought power protected him from consequence, and now it sat among freezer-burned peas, beside someone else's forgotten leftovers, because that's what Rick had become. Not erased, just left a place where no one wanted to go. And in the precinct's records, his personnel file was quietly marked inactive. No honors, no ceremony. The box with his name on it was slid into storage beside dozens of others, some for officers who'd retired with pride, others who hadn't made it home. Rick's sat untouched. The tape holding it closed peeled at the edges, like the history inside it was trying to breathe again. Recruits passed that shelf on their first day. They didn't ask. Instructors didn't explain, but someone had circled Rick's file number in red, not for retrieval, for warning, and that was the final sentence of his career. Not fired, not praised, just filed and frozen. That red circle stayed for years. Not one person ever removed it, not even when the ink began to fade, bleeding into the cardboard like a scar into skin. New officers were never told who Rick Dalton was, not directly, but they were told to check the shelf. They were told to ask themselves what a badge means before they earn one. And maybe that was the only justice left. Not a trial, not a sentence, just a quiet shift in how the next generation stepped into a uniform, not with swagger, but with memory, of a man who thought the badge made him untouchable, until it couldn't even keep him remembered. Some stories die in silence, others return in signal, and some come back wrapped in fire and footage. The video dropped without a name, no watermark, no origin, just 63 seconds of heat, dust, and shadow. A rescue mission deep in Kandahar, camera shaking under the weight of gunfire and debris, and at the center, a man without insignia but with one mark, inked behind the ear just below the hairline, where the lens caught him by accident or fate. It was Ezra Maddox, not standing tall, not posing, just moving. efficient, pulling a child from concrete rubble blown half apart. No mask, no rank, only eyes. Cold, precise, awake. Behind him more followed. They didn't shout, they didn't salute. They moved in silence, coordinated like a muscle that had done this before. None wore patches, but they were all marked. The black phoenix stamped at the nape like a forgotten warning. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't leaked from a press room. It was war, and it had a witness, the internet. Within hours, TikTok slowed the clip down, added strings and captions, ghost ops. Twitter dissected it frame by frame, identifying loadouts, weapon mods, and satellite tags that didn't exist in official records. Reddit exploded with maps, coordinates, conspiracy breakdowns. Who were they? Why no insignia? Who was the front man? The Pentagon issued a line colder than silence. We have no record of such a unit. That was all it took. Black Phoenix wasn't a team. It was a rumor with a pulse, now gone viral, turning myth into memory and memory into proof. Maddox never spoke, but the clip spoke for him, louder than any statement could. In one frame he turned just slightly. No camera would have noticed, except they did. His face bare, his expression unreadable. Behind him, heat shimmered off the broken city like breath. No helmet, no radio, just control. And then came the photo, older, blurry, unmistakable. Ezra Maddox in the background of a White House press briefing, not introduced, not labeled, standing half in shadow behind the president. The caption that circled the globe was simple. He was never supposed to be there, but he always is. Within 24 hours, the phrase Black Phoenix was trending in 6 languages. Fan art surfaced. Journalists begged for confirmation. Veterans whispered instead. We were pinned down. Someone cleared the ridge. No flag, no call sign, just that mark. Documentaries began forming. Urban legend met archived footage. A unit that doesn't exist had shown up again, exactly where they were never meant to be, and exactly when they were needed most. And so the myth returned, not as savior, not as hero, but as consequence. Maddox never posted. Never confirmed, never denied. He didn't need to. Because this time, the silence wasn't absent, it was an agreement. A ghost hadn't reappeared. The world had simply remembered who still walked through fire, when everyone else just talked. He was never supposed to be there, but now his shadow stretched even into places where shadows were forbidden. Rick Dalton received the envelope on a Thursday morning, slipped through his mailbox without a return address, no seal. No insignia, just his name, printed in exacting black. He opened it with the suspicion of a man already too familiar with bad news and worse timing. Inside, a single page, no letterhead, no title, a sentence. You ought to appear for review before a closed committee, time and loca. He sat for hours, rereading it, searching for something, authority, a loophole, a delay. But the more he looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a summons from a court. It wasn't a notice from his department. It was a command from somewhere that did not need to raise its voice. He made 2 calls, one to his old union rep, one to a friend still on the inside. The first said, ignore it. If there's no name, it doesn't exist. The second didn't answer. And then a third call came in, unlisted. The voice, that was the real warning, not the letter, the silence around it. The hearing room was colder than expected, not in temperature, but in tone. No flags behind the bench, no plaque with names, just a crescent table with 8 chairs and a single microphone at its center, red light blinking like an accusation on standby. Rick sat across from it, in a suit that didn't fit quite right anymore. Shoulders too sharp, sleeves a breath too long. He had worn uniforms most of his life. Civilian fabric itched more than Kevlar. No one introduced themselves. No one offered water. A woman in gray asked the first question. Can you state your relationship with the individual known as Ezra Maddox? Rick answered the way he had practiced, voice steady, eyes fixed. I don't know who that is. A pause. Another question, same shape, different skin. You encountered him roadside, you drew your weapon. Why? Rick swallowed. He was non-compliant. He posed a potential threat. The microphone blinked. The third question came from a man whose tie was too perfect. Did you recognize the name at the time? Rick hesitated. I did not. The pause after that was longer. Not silence. Something colder. The woman leaned forward, voice calm. You are aware his image was present in classified briefings for high-risk identifiers. Rick blinked. No one briefed us on Maddox. A murmur from the far end. Someone passed a folder forward. In it, stills from body cam footage, side by side with archived military intel. A circle around the tattoo, a label, Phoenix. Then, a name, Ezra Maddox. Then, nothing. No rank, no file, just a blank beneath it, redacted, but unmistakable. Rick stared. The woman in gray adjusted her glasses. Officer Dalton, you were trained at the Metro State Academy, class of 2002, correct? He nodded. Then you may recall the ethics module titled Asymmetrical Identification Protocols. He said nothing. She continued. One of the final slides featured an unnamed operative used in high-threat discretion training. That operative was Ezra Maddox. His face, his role, his silence. Someone coughed. The microphone clicked. We have a witness, the man in the perfect tie said. A door opened. Steps. A retired instructor from Metro State entered. No fanfare, just posture and regret. I taught that course, he said. That image, Maddox, it's shown in week 9. They don't get his name, but they get the face, and every cadet in Dalton's class saw it. Rick's voice cracked before it even rose. I don't remember. The instructor didn't flinch. You don't forget him. You just wish you had. No one raised their voice. No gavel struck wood. It didn't have to. The room itself was the verdict. Rick shifted in his seat. Spine too stiff, fingers twitching against the edge of the table. He wanted to protest, to argue protocol, to demand precedent, but every breath in that chamber was curated. Every silence is deliberate. He wasn't speaking to people. He was speaking to the structure they represented. We aren't here to judge your intent, the woman said. Only your awareness. Her words came like frost. In this system, not knowing is not innocence. It's negligence. Rick glanced at the folder again. His name was in it more times than he expected. His footage, his quotes, his fingerprint was beside a badge he no longer wore. I followed training, he said. The man in the tie nodded. You followed it until it became inconvenient. Another silence. Another page turned. When you saw the tattoo, someone asked, did you feel fear? Rick looked up, startled. What? The man repeated, slower. Did you feel fear? Rick exhaled through his teeth. I didn't feel anything. The woman raised an eyebrow. That, she said, is the problem. After the committee adjourned, no verdict was handed down. No reprimand, no public censure, just a clerk handing Rick a stamped receipt that read, attended. That was all it took. A whisper in a hallway. A folder moved from pending to archived, and a reputation sealed not by ruling, but by collective distance. Rick left the building the same way he entered, alone. The door closed behind him with a softness that felt like exile, and somewhere inside his name was still echoing, not as a warning, not as a memory, just as a lesson, quiet, chilling, final. Later that night, in a quiet motel room 2 hours outside the city, Rick sat at the edge of the bed, still in the suit, tie undone but not removed. He stared at the paper marked attended, as if it might change under pressure. It didn't. He folded it once, twice, a third time, until the stamp blurred into the crease. Then he dropped it in the trash. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just whispered to the walls. I knew exactly who he was, and the rules didn't answer, because it didn't need to. The whole system already had. The paper was unlined, the handwriting deliberate. Ezra Maddox wrote slowly, as if each word had to fight through years of noise to make itself heard. He had no desire to write it, but some silences needed structure, and some truths only made sense when laid bare in ink. He didn't draft it on a computer, he didn't dictate. He sat at a plain desk beneath a window that caught no light, pen to page, with a kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from decision. To the Department of Defense, The first line read, "You asked to commemorate what you never claimed." There was no anger in the letter, no pride either, only weight, measured, controlled, earned. "You want to name a building after me? Fund a scholarship, issue a medal," he continued. "But medals do not mend systems. Statutes do not shield the weak. And no honor given in silence can outweigh a voice that was once ignored." He paused between sentences, not for effect, but because the words deserved space. "I do not accept," he wrote, "not because I hold a grudge, but because I no longer hold a place in your theater." Then came the line that would echo across continents. "I don't want anyone to bow their head for me. I want them to lift their heads for themselves." The letter was never intended for publication, yet it reached a newsroom anyway, quietly handed off by someone who believed it didn't belong in a file cabinet, but in the open. It was scanned, uploaded, and typeset in black serif on an off-white background. No commentary, no headline, just the letter itself, unfiltered. Within hours it spread, shared in group chats, reposted by veterans, quoted by teachers, not because of who wrote it, but because of how it refused to shout. On a live broadcast 2 days later, a teenager, 14, black, wearing a faded hoodie, was invited to read it aloud on national television. He did so without stumbling. His voice trembled only once at the line about lifting heads, then silence. He folded the page and looked at the anchor beside him. She didn't speak, neither did he. The segment ended without applause, without music, just a single image, the boy holding the letter against his chest like armor. The New York Times called it the most reprinted public document of the month. Universities taught it in ethics seminars, activists printed it on placards. But Ezra never issued a follow-up. He didn't add context. He didn't appear in interviews. The words had been enough, more than enough. In the weeks that followed, the letter was framed in coffee shops, whispered in sermons, folded into the pockets of protesters and principals alike. It didn't demand change. It invited recognition. Ezra's refusal wasn't defiance, it was discipline. The discipline to not let the system rewrite his silence into symbolism. He left no return address. He signed with nothing more than his initials. And yet, the message carried more weight than any speech from a podium. Some called it a rejection of patriotism. Others, the purest form of it. But most people didn't argue. They just read it again, slowly, alone, letting the words settle in the quiet between their questions. Not about Ezra, but about themselves. Because that was the point. And the power of a letter that asked for no praise was that no one could stop hearing it long after it was read. The letter had not asked for a legacy. Yet legacy arrived anyway, slow and undeniable, like dawn creeping beneath doors no one meant to leave open. It began with a line item in a city document, a summary report from the police department's internal review board. Buried in the appendix on page 34 was a single sentence about the subject identified as Ezra Maddox. That was all. No title, no caution, no redaction. Just the name. Finally printed, but that was enough. By noon, over 3,000 users had changed their profile pictures to the same image. A silhouette of Ezra's side profile, the black phoenix faintly traced behind his ear, a single line beneath it that read, "He never had to speak." The image spread across social media not as a protest, but as a memory, shared in silence, in solidarity, in something deeper than slogans. That same afternoon, a letter appeared in the local paper's opinion column, typed, signed, dated. "I taught Ezra Maddox in the 5th grade," it began. "He was quiet, not shy, just listening. Always listening. When the other boys raised their hands, he watched. When the class laughed, he waited. That boy had eyes like storm glass. You couldn't always see the weather, but you knew it was forming." Major news networks aired the letter in full. Anchors didn't read it aloud. They just let it scroll beneath them as footage rolled. School hallways, police stations, and finally, the blurred footage of Ezra lifting a child from dust and ruin. No narration. Just music and that name, appearing at the bottom right of the screen like a watermark on truth. And somewhere across the country, a mural began. Not commissioned, not planned, but painted on brick, overnight, by hands that signed nothing, just the word EZA-RA in white block letters 10 feet tall. The city didn't paint over it, they repainted the wall around it. By evening, the name Ezra wasn't trending. It didn't need to. It had settled deeper than the feed. People weren't talking about him. They were thinking in his name. A librarian in Philadelphia placed a printout of the letter beside the checkout counter. A pastor in Kansas quoted it in a sermon, not as scripture but as a reflection. We do not kneel because he asked us to. We rise because he reminded us we could. Television hosts, once cautious, now referred to Ezra moments. The pause before judgment, the silence after impact, the decision not to speak louder but to stand stiller. And yet, despite the reach, no institution claimed him. No party tried to brand him. No brand tried to sell him. That, perhaps, was the truest proof of his impact. He couldn't be bought, so they just remembered him. An archivist at a university library created a dedicated folder. It didn't hold medals or records, just the things left behind. A photo from Kandahar, a reprinted op-ed, a printout of the mural. On its cover, handwritten in pencil, a single line, a man whose silence reorganized the noise. And somewhere, in a classroom not far from the first place Ezra ever sat, a child asked the teacher, "Why do people stop when they hear that name?" The teacher didn't answer, not at first. She just wrote it on the board, slowly, in capital letters. EZRA, then turned back and said, "Because some names aren't just remembered, they're carried." And outside that same school, etched in chalk on the pavement by hands too small to spell it perfectly, were 4 crooked letters and a question mark, SRA. But even misspelled, the message held, because sometimes it's not the perfection of a name that matters, it's the pause it creates. And Ezra Maddox, finally spoken aloud by the same systems that once erased him, had become not just a person to remember, but a moment to return to, again and again, in quiet. The chalk had barely faded when Rick Dalton stepped onto that sidewalk. The name still whispered beneath his shoes, even if misspelled, even if temporary. It was late morning, sunlight sharp enough to slice shadows from concrete, and Rick stood without badge, without backing, only the weight of a name that no longer excused him. Ezra Maddox lived 3 blocks from that school, in a house that didn't stand out because he never wanted to. Rick approached it like a man headed for sentencing, not resolution. He knocked once, not hard, not loud, just enough to be heard, just enough to be ignored. The door opened anyway. Ezra stood in the frame. Plain shirt, no weapon, no expression. Time didn't seem to pass in that moment. Only breathe. "I need to hear it," Rick said. His voice wasn't broken, just stripped of its armor. "From your mouth, that you forgive me." Ezra didn't blink, didn't narrow his eyes. He didn't need to. His gaze alone flattened whatever righteousness Rick had mustered. Then he spoke, soft, certain, final. "I don't hold forgiveness in my hands." He turned and walked back inside. The door remained open. Not as an invitation, but as a declaration. "I'm not hiding. I don't need to close anything. You just don't belong inside." Rick remained on the porch, sunlight biting into his skin. No crowd, no protest, no witness. Just one man, waiting for a weight to lift that would not. Not because Ezra refused it, but because it had never belonged to him to grant. Rick didn't leave, not right away. He stood there as if the sun might melt something in him, but no redemption dripped from his shoulders, just sweat, just silence. A car passed. A curtain twitched, but no one stopped, no one pointed. He was no longer infamous, just invisible. He sat on the steps, elbows on knees, looking not at the house, but at his own shadow, wondering when it had become shorter than the weight it cast. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the porch swallowed his voice. Maybe that was the punishment, not exile, but irrelevance. A man no longer feared, no longer respected, not even hated, just unremarked. An hour passed, maybe more. Then came the sound of sneakers on pavement. A boy, maybe 12, maybe 15, walked by, backpack hanging off one shoulder, earbuds out. He slowed only slightly when he saw Rick, then paused. Not afraid, not curious, just watching. "You're the guy from the clip?" the boy said. No malice, no awe, just a fact. Rick looked up, squinting. "Yeah," the boy nodded, not approving, not condemning, just thinking. "If I ever get shot," he said slowly, "I hope I can keep my eyes open like he did." And then he walked on. Rick didn't follow. He didn't reply. He just lowered his head, not in shame, not in grief, but in recognition. Because the boy hadn't meant it as praise. He had meant it as a measure, and Rick knew he would never reach it. He remained there a while longer. Long after the boy's footsteps had faded into traffic, the sun slid further west, casting Rick's shadow thinner, longer, stretching it across pavement like a rumor with no one left to tell. Behind him, the door never closed, but neither did it open again. Ezra's silence remained louder than any sermon, heavier than any apology, and in that stillness, Rick understood the final truth, that sometimes the only thing heavier than guilt is knowing the story has moved on without you. The next morning, long before traffic stirred and while dew still clung to windshields like breath not yet spoken, Ezra Maddox started the engine of his car and drove without a word. No packed bags, no farewell. Just motion, steady, unhurried, like someone not escaping but completing a sentence. The tires hummed low against the road, the sun not yet high enough to cast shadows long, just wide enough to let him pass through unnoticed. There was no one waiting, no cameras, no orders to report, just There was no one waiting, no cameras, no orders to report, just the open stretch of highway that unfurled like a ribbon pulled taut between silence and memory. As he crossed the first county line, a young patrol officer, freshly transferred, barely out of the academy, spotted the vehicle from a roadside post. He reached for the radar, paused, then just watched. The car didn't speed, didn't swerve. He rolled forward with the kind of command that didn't ask for permission. He put the radar gun down. He didn't. 3 blocks later, an elderly man tending his front yard lifted his hand, not high, not waving, just enough to be seen. It wasn't the gesture of a fan, it was something else, something older, recognition maybe, or debt, or the quiet bond of men who have seen too much and spoken too little. Ezra dipped his head in return, just once, then kept driving. By the time Ezra reached the edge of town, the morning had thickened into something golden, soft around the edges, the way endings often are when no one calls them by name. He didn't check the mirror. He didn't need to. What was behind him was not unfinished. It was simply no longer his to carry. His hands rested on the wheel with the quiet control of someone who had long ago stopped gripping the past too tightly. Back in the city, in a secure office inside the Department of Defense, a clerk keyed in a final entry. No press release, no ceremony, just a line added to a digital ledger, tucked inside a database only a few ever accessed. Plate number, vehicle description, and a status tag marked Perpetual Clearance, Honor Archive. The cursor blinked. The file closed, and that was the whole of it. Ezra Maddox had left the map, but the map remembered him. He did not drive fast. There was no need. The road welcomed him, not as a hero, but as a man who had already done more than enough. As he reached a state border, a roadside camera blinked, recorded, then stalled. An internal buffer paused just long enough not to save the image. No one would trace the footage. No one would file the motion. His departure, like his presence, was exacting and clean, and so he drove into the quiet, into whatever came next, not with fanfare, with gravity. Behind him, the town resumed. Doors opened, radios clicked on, and routines returned. But in one room, an archive, dim and climate-controlled, a monitor glowed quietly, showing no alerts, just the name Ezra Maddox in a line of text. Grayed but never deleted. No badge, no decoration, just a note. Permanent status, do not reassess. And though no one stood at a podium, though no medals were pinned, his legacy passed not by mouth, but by motion. A story told in absence, in silence, in the way people pause when a name is spoken. Ezra had left, but he had not vanished, because some departures leave echoes, and some men never need to return to be remembered.